Section 13. The end of the socialist period in the 1980s. In 1980, worker strikes began throughout Poland. The reason was an increase in food prices, as usual. Added to this were other immediate problems, such as the dismissal of labor activists for their opposition activities. For example, Anna Valentinovich was fired from the Lenin shipyard. Karl Modzelewski, one of the authors of the open letter to the party, proposed a name for this workers' movement: solidarity. On the ideological makeup of the movement, we read, quote, Solidarity's advisors belonged to various opposition movements. The most influential included representatives of the Catholic or Christian democratic orientation, Mazowiecki, but among the experts, there were also supporters of social democratic ideology, Geremik, Michnik, Kuran, and Marxism, Kowalik. End of quote. By the term Marxism, this book means Stalinism. So the workers were influenced by Stalinists, social democrats, but mostly by representatives of the religious movement. Michnik, whom this textbook classifies as a social democrat, progressed to support the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. Solidarity was an ideologically contradictory movement, as were the classes that participated in this movement. Quote, Before the Congress in September-October 1981, the political character of solidarity was still historically uncertain. On the one hand, solidarity was the result of the rise of the masses of the Polish working class, including a third of the rank and file of the ruling PZPR. On the other hand, its leadership was dominated by a group of people committed to the Catholic Church and sympathetic to the democratic, quote-unquote, imperialists. For example, in the fall of 1980, Walesa welcomed the election of Reagan as a good sign for Poland. End of quote. And more on the ideology of the Polish workers. Quote, Every day at the Gdańsk shipyard, the cradle of solidarity began with prayer. The shipyard gates were decorated with flowers, portraits of Pope John Paul II, and icons. General confessions were held and prayer services were served. Some priests, for example, Jankowski, practically did not leave the territory of the striking enterprises. There was no democracy in the leadership of Solidarity, although there was the appearance of congresses and long discussions. Quote, Ordinary members of Solidarity did not always agree with the position of the leadership, believing that decisions were made without sufficient consideration of their positions in private. Separately, a few words should be said about the leader of Solidarity, Lech Walesa. As a result of the political struggle within Poland itself, security service documents were published. From these documents, it became known that Walesa worked for the security service under the pseudonym Bolek. For example, we see this in Euronews. He carried out the decisions that the security service dictated to him. In exchange, he received the 1983 Nobel Prize, a luxury apartment, at a time when real labor activists were being evicted from their apartments and then became president of Poland in 1990. There were rumors about this before. For example, Karol Modzelewski, in a book published in 2013, wrote, quote, "The hypothesis that Walesa allegedly led Solidarity at the instigation of the security service is, without a doubt, the most incredible nonsense in the politically engaged historiography of our time." Unfortunately, this turned out to be true. In terms of his ideology, Walesa should be seen as a demagogue. Quote, "Being completely confident in himself, he was not embarrassed by the low level of his education and almost boasted of it." Walesa later admitted that he did not even read the program compiled for him by his assistants. As one among his trump cards, he considered his purely Polish origin, expressing his readiness to document this and calling on other leaders to do the same. In such statements, anti-Semitic notes were clearly heard, which appealed to certain circles in Poland. On December 13, 1981, General Jaruzelski declared martial law in Poland. Solidarity activists were suppressed, that is, imprisoned, or attracted to the side of nomenklatura through material benefits and blackmail, like Walesa. General Jaruzelski, quote, stated his readiness to continue the line of dialogue, but at the same time emphasized that the dangerous line followed by confrontation is already close, and the party will stop at nothing to preserve the gains of socialism. It should be understood that when the nomenclatura speaks of the gains of socialism, it first of all speaks of its privileged position, of its power in society. Modzelewski writes, quote, Walesa was arrested at his home on December 13, 1981, and placed, without any legal justification, in a kind of golden cage. At first, it was at the villa of the Ministry of Internal Affairs in Chalice near Warsaw. There, he was visited by Deputy Prime Minister Rakowski, Minister Czosek, and representatives of security service, trying to persuade him to lead the puppet Solidarity, reactivated and purged of extremists. This was the so-called Renaissance operation, planned apparently in the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which indicates a characteristic code name, and was very dangerous for us. Actually, this operation was successful because Walesa has been collaborating with the security service since 1970. Poland in the 20th century writes, quote, Walesa's authority grew even more after he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1983. Using his influence and striving to achieve agreement with the authorities, Walesa called on the United States and Western European countries to abandon the sanctions against Poland imposed after December 13, 1981, and had a very painful impact on the Polish national economy, which during the reign of Gierek significantly moved closer to the world economy. As a result of repression by the bureaucracy, the genuine solidarity movement was destroyed. Only a semblance remained, led by Walesa and some other members of the leadership. Modzilevsky writes, "The first solidarity was strangled and did not come back to life. It is here that the answer to the question that Laiano Jospin and Emilio Gabala asked me is contained. How could solidarity allow the Baltzerovich plan to be implemented? It did not resist because it no longer existed." Section 14. Transformation of neo-Stalinism into the regime of restoration of capitalism. Part of the nomenclatura was interested in the reforms, that is, the course towards the restoration of capitalism. Poland in the 20th century writes, Prime Minister Rakowski proposed a number of those liberal changes in the economic sphere. The introduction of free circulation of foreign currency, permission to lease state property, the creation of commercial banks, etc. All this was supposed to create interest in reforms from outside nomenclatura, which of course was primarily able to take advantage of the results of economic liberalization. Modzilevsky writes, "Back in the summer of 1981, our uncensored magazines angrily rejected the accusation that we were anti-socialist, and this was not hypocrisy. The editors of our press argued that the anti-socialist force is precisely the apparatus of the ruling party, because it is they who oppose the working class. We should be clear that it is the members of the nomenclatura who were interested in transformation towards capitalism." In the article Privatization in Poland, we read, "By 1986, these management bureaucrats were arranging privatization which would leave them owners of the state enterprises they had controlled. One method for achieving this privatization was to merge the state enterprise with a private enterprise and undervalue the state assets in the merger. The private enterprises involved in the merger were typically created and controlled by the managers of the state enterprises." End of quote. In the article New Old Rulers of Poland, we read, "Privatization is producing not liberal capitalism, but the blatant appropriation of collective property by the former Stalinist nomenclatura. Those we in Poland call them. Honest privatization was not possible as no significant amount of capital existed in Poland, which would allow the capitalists to buy up large state enterprises." In the same article quoted above, we read, quote, "Capitalism is not taking off in Poland in part because, like other Eastern European countries, the Polish economy is lacking capital. The level of foreign investment is very low and not yet significant on a national scale. In 75% of existing joint ventures, the foreign capital is higher than 50%. End of quote. And further, after 10 years of struggling against bureaucracy, Polish workers find that the main social base of recent pro-market reforms is the same group of people who decided, supported, or accepted the introduction of the martial law regime in 1981. Although the program is imposed by a so-called Solidarność government, headed by many members of the former opposition, it is not the workers, but the bureaucracy, the former nomenclatura, which is reaping the rewards. For example, Mr. Wilczek, a former member of the Jaruzelski government, is mentioned by the Polish press as the richest person in the country. He is able to act with his private wealth as well as bourgeoisie in the West do. In Gdańsk, Zenon Jurema, general manager of the state retail monopoly, became chief executive of a new private department store, which he is able to supply with concessions from the position he retained in the bureaucracy. End of quote. After the martial law was imposed and the original solidarity repressed, the new solidarity supported pro-capitalism reforms with its authority. Modzelewski writes, during martial law, solidarity changed significantly. The mass labor movement, clothed in the structural forms of trade union associations, disappeared, and in its place, cadre anti-communist illegal conspirators appeared. The banner remained the same, but the social essence of the movement became completely different. The workers' strikes were suppressed with the help of Walesa, whom the workers once almost carried out of the enterprise in a garbage can. Kuron, now as a Minister of Social Welfare, also played a significant role in repressing strikes. See his book, The 7 Years of Who Has Stolen Poland. In 1989, Solidarity held a round table with members of the government. But, quote, at the round table, the problems of the so-called nomenclatura privatization were not addressed. The essence of the latter was that during the economic reforms of the 1980s, conditions have been created for the transfer of part of state property into private hands, but it was mainly representatives of the nomenclatura who were able to take advantage of these conditions. Opposition figures have more than once expressed the idea that the communists should be given the opportunity to adopt and benefit from the market economy. End of quote. Thus, the opposition, and above all, the former advisors from CORE, played into the hands of the capitalist aspirations of part of the nomenclatura. The correct policy was to speak as loudly as possible about the capitalist plans of the nomenclatura, to tear off the veils from the round table and the notorious democracy of the government. But this required being Lenin denouncing the plans of the provisional government and not the provocateur Walesa. Many industrial enterprises in Poland were closed. For example, Lenin shipyard in Gdańsk, which led the way in the strike movement. Industrial production fell by more than 30% across the country. The same thing happened with salaries. Millions of workers were left without work. But the likes of Walesa and the Catholic priests were driving Mercedes-Benz cars.